The wealthy Henderson family thought their Uncle Robert was just a pathetic old veteran embarrassing them at the funeral. They had no idea that in less than 2 hours, everything they believed about inheritance, respect, and family would be shattered forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across Greenwood Cemetery as black luxury cars pulled into the circular drive. The funeral of Margaret Henderson, matriarch of one of Chicago's most prominent real estate families, had drawn over 200 mourners to the ornate Gothic chapel. Among the sea of designer black clothing and perfectly styled hair, one figure stood out like a sore thumb. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Bobby Henderson, 68, stood near the back of the gathering in his only dress uniform, a faded navy dress, blue from his days as a petty officer, complete with ribbons that most people couldn't identify. The uniform was clean but clearly old, the fabric showing wear at the elbows and a slight fading that spoke of many years in a closet. His gray hair was neatly combed but cut in a simple style that probably cost him $15 at a neighborhood barbershop. His shoes were polished military black, but they were regulation issue from decades ago, not the Italian leather that adorned every other male foot in attendance. Bobby had served 22 years in the Navy, including 3 tours in Vietnam as a submarine sonar operator. After his service, he'd worked quietly as a maintenance supervisor at a Chicago public school district for another 25 years before retiring on a modest pension. While his late sister Margaret built a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions, Bobby lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the South Side, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and shopped with coupons at the local grocery store. The family had always viewed Bobby as the embarrassing relative, the one who never made anything of himself, who chose service over success, who seemed content with a simple life while they climbed social ladders and accumulated wealth. At family gatherings, he was the uncle who sat quietly in the corner, listening more than talking, wearing clothes from department stores while everyone else flaunted designer labels. As mourners filed into the chapel, Bobby's presence became increasingly noticeable to his nephew and nieces. David Henderson, 45, Margaret's eldest son and current CEO of Henderson Properties, adjusted his $3,000 Armani suit and shot uncomfortable glances toward his uncle. David had built his identity around the family's success story: Harvard MBA, luxury penthouse, membership in the most exclusive clubs in Chicago. Having his working-class Navy veteran uncle visible at such a high-profile event felt like a stain on the family image he'd carefully cultivated. "Jesus Christ," David muttered to his sister Catherine as they took their seats in the front row. "Look at him. He looks like he's going to a VFW meeting, not our mother's funeral." Catherine Henderson Walsh, 42, turned slightly to glance back at Bob. She was an art gallery owner in Lincoln Park, married to a prominent surgeon, and considered herself the family's cultural ambassador. Her outfit alone, a custom black Chanel suit with vintage pearls, cost more than Bobby's monthly pension check. "I can't believe he wore that old uniform," Catherine whispered back. "Doesn't he own a proper suit? This is the Tribune Society pages, for God's sake. Everyone important in Chicago is here." She gestured discreetly toward the assembled crowd that included judges, politicians, business leaders and socialites who formed Chicago's elite circles. The youngest sibling, Patricia Henderson Moore, 38, joined the conversation from her seat beside Catherine. Patricia was a prominent divorce attorney who'd inherited her mother's sharp business instincts and her father's ruthless streak. She'd made partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms by age 34 and had no patience for anything she perceived as weakness or mediocrity. "He's always been an embarrassment," Patricia said quietly, her voice carrying just enough venom to make her feelings clear. "Living in that crappy apartment, driving that piece of junk car, working as a janitor essentially. Mother always felt sorry for him, but honestly, some people just don't have what it takes to succeed." As the service began, Bobby remained standing near the back, his hands clasped behind him in a military at ease position that was as natural to him as breathing. The minister spoke eloquently about Margaret's business acumen, her charitable work, and her role in shaping Chicago's downtown development over the past 3 decades. Photo montages displayed her cutting ribbons at building dedications, shaking hands with mayors and governors, and receiving awards from various civic organizations. During the eulogy, several family friends and business associates spoke about Margaret's legacy. They talked about her vision, her determination, and her ability to see potential where others saw obstacles. They mentioned her real estate developments that had transformed neighborhoods, her charitable foundation that had funded education initiatives, and her role as a mentor to young women in business. Bobby listened to every word with a slight smile, his eyes occasionally glistening with unshed tears. While others saw Margaret the successful businesswoman, he remembered Maggie, his little sister who used to follow him around their working-class neighborhood, asking endless questions about everything from baseball statistics to how submarines work. He was the one who'd encouraged her to apply for college scholarships when their parents thought higher education was a waste of money for a girl. He was the one who'd sent her part of his Navy pay to help with expenses during her first years building her business. But none of that was mentioned in the eulogies. The family's narrative had long since been scrubbed clean of their humble beginnings, rewritten to suggest that success and sophistication had always been their birthright. Bobby's presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of a past they preferred to forget. As the service progressed, David's discomfort grew more obvious. He noticed influential business contacts glancing toward Bobby, probably wondering who the elderly man in the outdated military uniform was and why he seemed to be family. Every time someone looked in Bobby's direction, David felt his carefully maintained reputation taking a small hit. During a particularly moving musical interlude, Bobby removed a small, worn photograph from his jacket pocket, a picture of him and Margaret from 1975, taken the day she'd signed the lease on her first office space. She was beaming with excitement while he stood proudly beside her in his navy dress whites, having taken leave to be there for her big moment. He'd co-signed the lease when banks wouldn't take a chance on a young woman with big dreams, but little collateral. The sight of Bobby holding what appeared to be some old photograph only intensified his relatives' embarrassment. To them it looked like their uncle was being overly sentimental and inappropriate, drawing attention to himself during their mother's dignified farewell. As the chapel service concluded and mourners began to file out for the graveside ceremony, the tension in the Henderson family was palpable. They faced another hour of public exposure with their embarrassing uncle visible to Chicago's elite, and their patience was wearing thin. Little did they know that Margaret Henderson had been planning this day for years, and their Uncle Bobby was about to become the most important person in their lives, whether they liked it or not. The procession to the graveside was a study in contrast. A line of gleaming luxury vehicles, Mercedes, BMWs and Bentleys, wound slowly through the manicured cemetery grounds, their occupants dressed in thousands of dollars worth of black designer clothing. Walking alongside this motorized parade of wealth was Bobby Henderson, his polished but worn military shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. Bobby had declined David's half-hearted offer of a ride in one of the family cars. "I prefer to walk," he'd said simply, and the family had been secretly relieved. The last thing they needed was their embarrassing uncle cramped into a luxury sedan with Chicago's business elite, making small talk about his apartment maintenance job, or his service in a war most of them preferred to forget. As the group assembled around Margaret's final resting place, the social dynamics became even more pronounced. The cemetery had provided an elegant tent with rows of folding chairs for the immediate family and VIP guests. The Henderson children automatically took their places in the front row, their spouses beside them, presenting a picture of refined grief that would look perfect in tomorrow's Tribune obituary photos. Bobby stood behind the seated guests, his hands clasped in front of him in what anyone with military experience would recognize as a respectful parade rest position. To the civilian mourners, he simply appeared to be standing awkwardly, unsure of his place in the family hierarchy. Several of Margaret's business associates whispered quietly among themselves, wondering who the elderly man in the military uniform was, and why he seemed disconnected from the well-dressed family members. Judge Harrison Blackwell, a longtime friend of Margaret's and prominent figure in Chicago's legal community, leaned over to David during the minister's opening remarks. "I don't believe I know your uncle," he whispered diplomatically. "Was he military?" David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He's My mother's brother, he replied, his tone carefully neutral but carrying an undertone of apology. Navy, he served in Vietnam. The way David said it made Bobby's military service sound like a minor footnote rather than 22 years of dedicated service to his country. Catherine overheard the exchange and felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She turned slightly to glance at Bobby, noting how his faded uniform contrasted sharply with the sea of expensive black clothing surrounding them. Her husband, Richard Walsh, was already fielding curious looks from his medical colleagues, and Catherine could practically feel their social standing diminishing with every moment Bobby remained visible. The minister continued with the graveside service, reading passages about eternal rest and celebrating a life well lived. As he spoke about Margaret's legacy and the impact she'd had on Chicago's development, Bobby's eyes wandered to the impressive granite headstone that had been prepared for his sister. Margaret Elizabeth Henderson, beloved mother, visionary leader, 1952-2024, was engraved in elegant script, followed by a quote about building dreams into reality. What the headstone didn't mention was that Margaret's first office had been Bobby's kitchen table in his cramped studio apartment near the Navy base. It didn't mention the countless evenings when Bobby had helped his sister review contracts, using skills he'd learned managing supply logistics for submarine crew. It didn't mention that when Margaret needed her first major investment to purchase a rundown building in what would become Chicago's hottest development district, it was Bobby who'd liquidated his entire military retirement account to help her buy it. As the service continued, Bobby noticed several prominent Chicago figures in attendance. Mayor Patricia Coleman stood near the back with her security detail. Real estate magnate Jonathan Fitzgerald, Margaret's biggest competitor and occasional business partner, had sent a massive floral arrangement and attended personally. The heads of 3 major banks that had financed Margaret's developments over the years were present, along with city council members, prominent attorneys, and socialites whose names regularly appeared in the society pages. Patricia Henderson Moore watched this assembly of power and influence with growing anxiety. As a divorce attorney who dealt with Chicago's wealthiest families, she understood how quickly reputations could be damaged and social connections severed. Having their blue-collar uncle standing there like a reminder of their humble origins felt like a liability she couldn't afford. During a moment of silence, Patricia made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She stood up from her front row seat and walked back to where Bobby was standing. Her voice was low but carried clearly to several nearby mourners, including Judge Blackwell and Dr. Walsh. "Uncle Bobby," she said, her tone mixing forced politeness with unmistakable irritation. "Don't you think it would be more appropriate if you stepped back a bit? This is a very formal ceremony, and frankly, you're embarrassing the family." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Several mourners turned to look, their expressions ranging from shock to curious. Bobby's face remained impassive, but those who knew how to read military bearing could see the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eye. "Patricia," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to maintaining discipline under pressure. "I'm here to honor my sister's memory. Nothing more, nothing less." But Patricia was beyond caring about diplomacy. The stress of the day, the pressure of maintaining appearances, and years of accumulated resentment toward Bobby's failure to live up to the family's elevated status, had reached a breaking point. "Your sister built something remarkable," Patricia continued, her voice rising slightly. "She created a legacy, a reputation, a business empire that employs hundreds of people. And here you are, showing up in that old uniform like you're at some VFW barbecue instead of the funeral of one of Chicago's most respected business leaders." David and Catherine exchanged panicked glances. Their sister had crossed a line, publicly humiliating their uncle in front of some of the most influential people in Chicago. Several mourners were now openly staring, and the minister had paused his remarks, uncertain how to proceed. Bobby looked at Patricia for a long moment, then at David and Catherine, who were pointedly avoiding eye contact. His gaze swept over the assembled crowd of Chicago's elite, many of whom were watching the family drama unfold with the fascination that wealthy people reserved for public displays of dysfunction. "I see," Bobby said finally, his voice still calm but carrying something that made Patricia take an unconscious step backward. "I embarrass the family." Judge Blackwell, who had witnessed more family drama in his courtroom than most people saw in a lifetime, recognized the dangerous quiet in Bobby's voice. Dr. Walsh shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware that he was watching something that shouldn't be happening at a funeral. The minister cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue with the service," he suggested gently, but the damage was done. The moment had been witnessed by too many important people, and there was no taking it back. As the graveside service resumed, Bobby remained exactly where he was, but something fundamental had changed. The patient, deferential uncle who had quietly endured decades of condescension was gone, replaced by someone whose military bearings suggested depths that the Henderson family had never bothered to explore. In less than an hour they would discover just how catastrophically they had misjudged the situation. The remainder of the graveside service passed in uncomfortable tension. The minister completed his final prayers while the Henderson family sat rigidly in their front row seats, acutely aware that their public humiliation of Bobby had been witnessed by half of Chicago's power structure. Bobby remained standing in the same spot, his military bearing unchanged, but something in his stillness suggested a storm gathering force. As mourners began to disperse, expressing their condolences and making arrangements to attend the reception at the Four Seasons, the family dynamics became even more strained. David approached several of his mother's business associates, trying to gauge how much damage Patricia's outburst had caused to their reputation. The conversations were polite but noticeably cooler than usual, with several prominent figures offering brief condolences before excusing themselves rather than engaging in their typical networking small talk. Catherine was having similar difficulties with the social elite from her art world connections. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a major collector and patron of Catherine's gallery, offered a perfunctory handshake before mentioning that she needed to get back to the hospital, despite the fact that she was a retired psychiatrist who hadn't practiced in 5 years. The subtle snubs were adding up, and Catherine's anxiety was approaching panic level. Meanwhile, Patricia was discovering that her reputation as a sharp divorce attorney meant little when she'd just demonstrated a stunning lack of judgment in front of some of Chicago's most influential legal minds. Judge Blackwell, who had referred several high-profile cases to her firm over the years, simply nodded politely when she approached him and said he needed to speak with other colleagues. The message was clear. Patricia had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bobby watched these interactions from a distance, his expression unreadable. 22 years in the Navy had taught him to observe social dynamics and understand power structures, skills that translated perfectly to civilian situations. He could see his nephew and nieces struggling to maintain their social connections in the wake of their public display of family dysfunction, and part of him felt a familiar sadness at how little they understood about loyalty, respect, and the bonds that truly matter. As the crowd began to thin, Margaret's longtime attorney Harrison Caldwell of Caldwell Pearson Associates approached the family group. Caldwell was a distinguished man in his 70s who had handled the Henderson family's legal affairs for over 30 years. His presence commanded immediate attention from David, Catherine, and Patricia, who understood that he controlled access to their inheritance. "I need to speak with the immediate family about Margaret's estate," Caldwell announced in his measured baritone voice. "There are some arrangements that need to be discussed before the formal reading tomorrow." His eyes found Bobby's standing alone near the graveside. "Robert, I'll need you present as well." David stepped forward automatically, assuming his role as the family spokesperson. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell. Should we plan to meet at your office this afternoon? I know we're all eager to understand Mother's wishes and begin the transition of Henderson properties." Caldwell's expression was carefully neutral, giving away nothing about the contents of Margaret's will. "Actually, I think it would be more appropriate to discuss these matters at the Four Seasons reception." Margaret was quite specific about wanting certain conversations to happen in public settings. The way he emphasized public made all three siblings exchange nervous glances. Patricia, still smarting from her earlier humiliation and desperate to reassert some control over the situation, made her second catastrophic mistake of the day. "Miss Caldwell," she said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used in court, "I hope you understand that while we appreciate Uncle Bobby's presence today, any serious family business should be handled by those who actually understand the complexities of mother's estate. The attorney's eyebrows rose slightly. In 30 years of practicing law, he'd seen families destroy themselves over inheritance disputes, but rarely had he witnessed such spectacular self-sabotage in a public setting. "I see," he said carefully. "And you believe Robert doesn't understand complex business matters?" Catherine jumped in, sensing an opportunity to salvage their position. "What Patricia means is that Uncle Bobby has always been more practically minded. Mother's estate involves sophisticated real estate holdings, corporate structures, and financial instruments that require experience with high-level business operation." Her tone was condescending in the way that only truly privileged people could manage, suggesting that Bobby's working-class background made him inherently incapable of understanding their rarefied world. Bobby had been listening to this conversation with the same patience he'd once used to monitor sonar readings during 12-hour submarine patrols, but something in Catherine's dismissive tone triggered a memory. Margaret, at 22 years old, crying in his kitchen because a banker had told her that women didn't have the sophisticated understanding necessary to handle commercial real estate transactions. "Sophisticated business operations," Bobby repeated quietly, his voice carrying across the small group with surprising clarity. "Like the Chicago Harbor Development project that Margaret won in 19... The siblings looked at him with surprise. They'd never heard Bobby reference any specific details of their mother's business success, and his mention of one of Henderson Properties' most significant early projects caught them off guard. "That was Mother's first major municipal contract, David said slowly, uncertain where Bobby was going with this. "It established Henderson Properties as a serious player in Chicago commercial development." Bobby nodded thoughtfully. $43 million project, 12-month deadline, required coordinating with the Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, 3 different union crews, and the mayor's office. His recitation of details was precise, almost clinical. "Your mother was 28 years old and had never handled anything larger than small residential development." Patricia frowned, wondering how Bobby could possibly know such specific information about a project that had occurred when she was barely 10 years old. "I'm not sure what point you're trying to make, Uncle Bob." Bobby's eyes fixed on Patricia with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. "The point, Patricia, is that your mother didn't win that contract because of her sophisticated business understanding. She won it because someone with experience in large-scale logistics, government coordination, and complex project management helped her develop the proposal." The implications of Bobby's words hung in the air like a gathering thunderclap. Attorney Caldwell watched the exchange with the fascination of someone who understood that he was witnessing a family's entire foundation being stripped away piece by piece. "Someone with experience managing nuclear submarine maintenance schedules," Bobby continued, his voice growing stronger. "Someone who understood how to coordinate multiple federal agencies, work with unionized crews, and deliver critical projects on impossible deadlines." He paused, letting the full meaning sink in. "Someone who spent every evening for 6 weeks in 1987 helping his sister prepare the most important presentation of her career." David's face had gone pale. Catherine's mouth had fallen open slightly. Patricia was staring at Bobby as if seeing him for the first time, which, in many ways, she was. "You see," Bobby said quietly, "I may embarrass the family, but I helped build everything you're so proud of, and tomorrow morning, you're going to find out exactly what that means." Attorney Caldwell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation at the reception." Margaret was very specific about wanting certain revelations to happen in front of witnesses. As they walked toward the waiting cars, the Henderson family was beginning to realize that they had catastrophically misjudged their Uncle Bobby, but they had no idea how catastrophically until they heard what Margaret had written in her will.
The Four Seasons reception hall buzzed with the controlled energy of Chicago's elite engaged in their natural habitat, networking, deal-making, and subtle social positioning. The room was elegant in that understated way that only the truly wealthy could afford, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over arrangements of white orchids and lilies. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently through the crowd, offering champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvre to the 200 guests who had come to pay their respects to Margaret Henderson. Bobby stood near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Grant Park, still in his navy dress uniform, holding a glass of water instead of champagne.
He watched the social dynamics of the room with the same analytical precision he'd once used to track submarine movements on sonar. Clusters of real estate developers discussed upcoming projects, city council members shared quiet conversations about zoning decisions, and prominent attorneys networked with potential clients. It was a world that his nephew and nieces had fought desperately to join, and one they were terrified of losing. David worked the room with increasing desperation, trying to gauge how much damage the cemetery incident had caused to the Henderson family reputation. His conversations with key business contacts were noticeably shorter than usual, and several important figures who would normally seek him out for private discussions seemed to be avoiding him entirely. The whispered story of Patricia's public humiliation of the family's veteran uncle was spreading through the room like wildfire, and David could feel their carefully cultivated social standing crumbling with each awkward interaction. Catherine was having an equally difficult time with her social circle. The art world elite were notorious gossips, and news of the Henderson family's dysfunction had reached them within hours. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had snubbed Catherine at the cemetery, was now actively steering other collectors away from her, mentioning loudly enough to be overheard that she questioned the character and judgment of gallery owners who couldn't show basic respect to family members who had served their country. Patricia, meanwhile, was discovering that the legal community's memory was long and unforgiving. Judge Blackwell had already spoken to several colleagues about her shocking display of poor judgment and family disloyalty at the funeral. Two prominent divorce attorneys who had previously referred high-net-worth clients to her firm were now quietly suggesting that their wealthy clients might want to consider other representation. In the space of a few hours, Patricia had managed to damage professional relationships that had taken years to build. As the reception reached its peak, Attorney Caldwell moved to the center of the room and gently tapped a crystal glass with a silver knife. The sound cut through the conversations, and the crowd gradually turned their attention to the distinguished lawyer who had handled Margaret Henderson's affairs for 3 decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caldwell began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "As many of you know, Margaret Henderson was not only a visionary businesswoman, but also someone who believed deeply in family, loyalty, and recognizing the contributions of those who helped build her success." He paused, his eyes finding Bobby near the window. "She asked me to share some thoughts about her estate today, in the presence of friends and colleagues who understood her values." David stepped forward automatically, straightening his Armani tie and preparing to accept condolences and discuss the transition of Henderson Properties' leadership. Catherine and Patricia moved closer, ready to present a united front as the grieving family who would carry on Margaret's legacy. "Margaret's will," Caldwell continued, "reflects her deep understanding of who truly supported her throughout her career, and who shared the values of hard work, sacrifice, and integrity that she held dear." He removed a document from his briefcase, the official seal of his law firm clearly visible on the letterhead. "The primary beneficiary of Margaret Henderson's estate," Caldwell announced, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade, "including all real estate holdings, business interests, and financial assets totaling approximately $473 million, is her brother, Robert Henderson." The words hit the reception hall like a physical shockwave. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lip. The entire assembled crowd of Chicago's elite turned to stare at Bobby, who remained standing calmly by the window, his expression unchanged. David's face went white, then red, then white again. That's impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager. "There must be some mistake. Mother always said the business would stay in the family." Caldwell's expression remained professionally neutral. "The business is staying in the family, David. Robert is family." He consulted the document in his hand. "Margaret's will specifically states that she is leaving her estate to the family member who understood the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and loyalty, the one who helped build everything we achieved without ever asking for recognition or reward." Catherine let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "But Uncle Bobby lives in a tiny apartment. He drives an old Honda. He worked as a janitor." Her voice carried across the silent room, her shock and dismay on full display for Chicago's most influential people. "Yes," Bobby said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the reception hall. His voice carried clearly through the hushed space. I chose to live simply because I learned in the Navy that happiness doesn't come from accumulating things. It comes from serving something bigger than yourself. He turned from the window to face the crowd, and for the first time that day, everyone in the room could see the quiet authority and dignity that 22 years of military service had instilled in him. Patricia, desperate to salvage something from the catastrophe, stepped forward with the aggressive confidence that had made her a successful attorney. Uncle Bobby, surely you understand that you're not equipped to run a complex business empire. Henderson Properties employs over 400 people and manages billions in assets. Perhaps we could discuss some kind of arrangement. Bobby's response was so quiet that the entire room strained to hear it. Patricia, I helped design the organizational structure you're talking about. I reviewed every major contract for the first 15 years of the company's existence. I provided the capital for the first 3 property acquisitions. He paused, letting this information sink in. The question isn't whether I'm equipped to run Henderson Property. The question is whether any of you have earned the right to be part of it. Attorney Caldwell cleared his throat. There is one additional provision in Margaret's will that the family should understand. She has left specific instructions regarding the future involvement of her children in the business. The Henderson siblings turned toward Caldwell with desperate hope, thinking that perhaps their mother had provided some safety net, some way for them to maintain their positions and lifestyle. Margaret's will states that David, Catherine, and Patricia may continue to work for Henderson Properties, Caldwell announced, provided they demonstrate the same values of respect, loyalty, and family dedication that she expected from all employees. They will start in entry-level positions and work their way up based on merit, just like any other employee. The implications hit them like a sledgehammer. No more executive positions, no more guaranteed income, no more social status based on inherited wealth. They would have to earn everything they had previously taken for granted. Bobby looked at his nephew and nieces, really looked at them for the first time in years. Your mother left you something more valuable than money, he said quietly. She left you a chance to discover who you really are when you have to earn respect instead of inheriting it. As the reality of their situation began to sink in, the Henderson children realized that their public humiliation of Uncle Bobby hadn't just been morally wrong, it had been the most expensive mistake of their lives. The silence in the Four Seasons reception hall stretched on for what felt like an eternity. 200 of Chicago's most powerful people stood frozen, champagne glasses suspended in midair, as they processed what they had just witnessed. The Henderson family drama had just become the most spectacular inheritance, reversal in the city's recent memory, and everyone present understood they were witnessing a story that would be told in Chicago's social circles for decades to come. Bobby remained by the window, his military bearing unchanged. But now every person in the room was seeing him through completely different eyes. The embarrassing uncle in the faded uniform had transformed before their very eyes into the most powerful real estate magnate in Chicago. The quiet dignity that his family had mistaken for weakness was now revealed as the confidence of someone who had never needed to prove himself to anyone. David was the first to break the silence, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. This is insane. Mother was clearly not in her right mind when she wrote this will. No rational person leaves a $400 million empire to someone who... He gestured frantically at Bobby's uniform, unable to finish the sentence without making his prejudices even more obvious. Attorney Caldwell's response was swift and professional. I can assure you that Margaret was thoroughly evaluated by 3 independent physicians and 2 psychiatrists before finalizing her estate plans. Her mental competency was documented extensively, and her reasoning was quite clear. He consulted his notes. She specifically mentioned that she wanted her legacy to go to someone who understood the value of $1 because he'd earned every one he'd ever had. Catherine burst into tears, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. Her gallery, her Lincoln Park lifestyle, her surgeon husband's medical practice, everything had been built on the assumption of inherited wealth that would never materialize. Uncle Bobby, she pleaded, surely we can work something out. We're family. Mother wouldn't have wanted us to lose everything. Bobby turned from the window to look at his niece, and for a moment his expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. Catherine, your mother didn't want you to lose everything. She wanted you to find everything. Self-respect, the satisfaction of earning your own way, the knowledge that you're capable of more than you've ever been asked to prove. His voice was gentle but firm. She gave you the greatest gift she could, a chance to discover who you really are. Patricia, her attorney's mind racing through possible legal challenges, stepped forward with renewed aggression. We'll contest this will. No court in Illinois would uphold such an obviously vindictive and irrational distribution of assets. Mother was clearly influenced by. She paused, realizing that accusing Bobby of manipulating Margaret would require her to explain how someone she'd just called incompetent could have orchestrated such a sophisticated legal maneuver. Judge Blackwell, who had been silently observing the family's meltdown, spoke for the first time. Patricia, as someone who has presided over hundreds of inheritance disputes, I can tell you that this will appears to be both legally sound and morally justified. His voice carried the authority of 3 decades on the bench. Your mother clearly understood exactly what she was doing, and why. The judge's public support of the will's validity sent a chill through Patricia's heart. If Harrison Blackwell, one of the most respected jurists in Illinois, was endorsing Margaret's decision, any legal challenge would be both expensive and futile. As word of the inheritance reversal spread through the reception, the social dynamics in the room shifted dramatically. Business associates who had been avoiding the Henderson children now approached Bobby with respectful interest. Mayor Patricia Coleman made her way through the crowd to introduce herself personally, discussing upcoming municipal development projects that Henderson Properties might be interested in bidding on. Real estate magnate Jonathan Fitzgerald, who had competed with Margaret for 30 years, approached Bobby with genuine admiration. Your sister was a remarkable woman, he said, extending his hand, and clearly, she was an excellent judge of character. If you ever want to discuss potential partnerships, I'd be honored to have that conversation. Bobby accepted the handshake with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the day. Mr. Fitzgerald, I appreciate that. Margaret always spoke highly of your integrity, even when you were competing for the same projects. David watched in horror as his mother's business network relationships he'd assumed would transfer to him automatically began forming around Bobby instead. The same people who had been politely distant during his attempts at networking were now eagerly seeking Bobby's attention and approval. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the prominent art collector who had snubbed Catherine earlier, approached Bobby with a warm smile. Mr. Henderson, I understand you've inherited some remarkable properties. I'd love to discuss commissioning some art installations for your commercial developments. I believe your sister had excellent taste in supporting local artists. Catherine realized with growing panic that her entire client base was about to pivot toward her uncle, leaving her gallery potentially without the wealthy patrons who had sustained her business for years. As the evening progressed, Bobby moved through the crowd with natural ease, discussing development projects with mayors, zoning issues with city council members, and financing structures with bank presidents. It became increasingly clear that his decades of quiet observation had given him a thorough understanding of Chicago's power structure and business environment. Attorney Caldwell approached Bobby near the end of the reception with a final piece of information. Robert, there's one more provision in Margaret's will that I haven't mentioned yet. He lowered his voice so only Bobby could hear. She established a $50 million trust fund for veterans' housing initiatives, to be administered entirely at your discretion. She said you would understand better than anyone how to help former service members transition back to civilian life. Bobby's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he absorbed this final gift from his sister. Margaret had not only recognized his contributions to her success, but had trusted him to carry on her legacy of helping others. The trust fund would allow him to address a problem he'd seen firsthand: fellow veterans struggling with housing insecurity after their service ended. As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, the Henderson siblings found themselves standing alone near the bar, their world completely transformed. The people who had once sought their attention were now following Bobby, eager to curry favor with Chicago's newest real estate emperor. Bobby approached them one final time, his expression serious but not unkind. David, Catherine, Patricia, he said quietly, your mother's offer stands. Entry-level positions at Henderson Properties, full benefits, and the opportunity to prove yourselves based on merit rather than birthright. The choice is yours." David's pride warred with his desperation. Catherine sobbed quietly, knowing she had no choice but to accept. Patricia stared at Bobby with a mixture of respect and resentment, finally understanding that the man she'd dismissed as an embarrassment was actually the most formidable person she'd ever encountered. "What do you say?" Bobby asked gently. "Are you ready to discover what you're really capable of?" As the Henderson children contemplated their new reality, Bobby Henderson, veteran, brother and now Chicago's most powerful real estate magnate, walked out into the Chicago night, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from quiet dignity, and the patience to let others reveal their true character. The family had learned too late that respect cannot be inherited, it must be earned, and Bobby Henderson had been earning it his entire life. The gleaming conference room on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, a fitting backdrop for what had become the most talked about business transformation in the city's recent history. Henderson Properties had not only maintained its position as one of Chicago's premier real estate development companies, but had expanded its influence under Bobby Henderson's leadership in ways that surprised even the most seasoned business observer. Bobby sat at the head of the polished mahogany conference table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that somehow managed to maintain the same quiet dignity his old uniform had possessed. At 68, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had finally found his proper place in the world. The morning's Wall Street Journal lay open beside his coffee cup, featuring a front-page article titled, "From Service to Success: How a Navy Veteran Revolutionized Chicago Real Estate." Around the table sat the Henderson Properties senior management team, a group that now included several military veterans Bobby had recruited from various service branches. Colonel Sarah Martinez, a former Army Corps of Engineers officer, served as the new director of development. Commander James Liu, a retired Navy logistics specialist, had taken over operations management. The integration of military precision and discipline into the company culture had resulted in projects completing ahead of schedule and under budget, a rarity in the construction industry. At the far end of the table sat David, Catherine and Patricia Henderson, though their positions in the company hierarchy had changed dramatically. David, who had once expected to inherit the CEO position, now worked as a junior project coordinator, learning the fundamentals of construction management from the ground up. His Armani suits had been replaced by practical work clothes, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who had spent the last 6 months actually visiting construction sites, instead of just approving budgets from corner offices. Catherine had accepted a position in the company's new community outreach division, focusing on public art installations in Henderson Properties development. Her art world connections had proven valuable, but she was learning to work within budgets and timelines rather than simply pursuing vanity projects for wealthy collectors. The experience had been humbling but surprisingly fulfilling. She was discovering that creating accessible art for working families provided a satisfaction that exclusive gallery openings had never delivered. Patricia had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation. The former high-powered divorce attorney now worked in Henderson Properties' legal compliance department, reviewing contracts and ensuring regulatory adherence under the supervision of the company's general counsel. Her sharp legal mind remained intact, but she was learning to use it in service of building things up rather than tearing them down through bitter divorce proceedings. Bobby had been watching his nephew and nieces carefully over the past 6 months, observing not just their work performance, but their character development. The results had been mixed but encouraging. David had initially approached his new role with barely concealed resentment, expecting special treatment and rapid promotion. It had taken 3 months of patient mentoring from Colonel Martinez before he began to understand that leadership was earned through competence and respect rather than inherited through family connection. "Before we begin today's meeting," Bobby announced, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had served him well in both military and business settings, "I want to share some news about the company's future direction." The room fell silent, with particular attention from David, Catherine and Patricia, who had learned to pay careful attention to Bobby's announcements. Their financial futures now depended entirely on their uncle's decisions,
a reality that had required significant psychological adjustment. Henderson Properties has been selected to lead the redevelopment of the South Side Veterans Housing Initiative, Bobby continued, consulting the documents in front of him. This is a $200 million project that will create affordable housing for former service members and their families. It represents the largest veterans-focused development project in Chicago's history. Colonel Martinez leaned forward with professional interest. Sir, that's tremendous news. The housing crisis among veterans has been a critical issue that most developers have avoided due to the complexity of federal funding requirements. Bobby nodded approvingly at his development director's assessment. Exactly. Which is why I've decided to assign the project leadership to someone who has demonstrated both personal growth and genuine commitment to the company's values over the past 6 months. David straightened in his chair, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since the funeral. Despite his initial resentment, he had gradually come to respect Bobby's leadership style and had thrown himself into learning every aspect of the development process. Perhaps his uncle was finally ready to recognize his progress. Catherine, Bobby said, turning toward his niece, I'm promoting you to Director of Community Development for the Veterans Housing Initiative. Your work integrating public art with affordable housing has been exceptional, and this project will require someone who understands both the aesthetic and social impact of our developments. Catherine's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. 6 months ago, she would have dismissed a promotion involving affordable housing as beneath her social status. Now she understood that this project would allow her to make a real difference in people's lives while advancing her career through merit rather than family connection. Patricia shifted nervously in her seat, wondering what role she might play in such a significant project. Her legal expertise would certainly be valuable, given the complex regulatory requirements of federal housing initiative. Patricia, Bobby continued, you'll be serving as the project's legal coordinator, working directly with HUD officials and veteran service organizations to ensure compliance with all federal requirements. Your experience with complex legal frameworks will be essential to the project's success. For the first time since the funeral, Patricia felt a genuine sense of professional purpose, working on legislation that helped fellow Americans rather than facilitating wealthy people's divorces, represented a fundamental shift in how she approached her legal career. And David, Bobby said, pausing to meet his nephew's eyes directly, you'll be serving as my deputy project manager. You've demonstrated real growth in understanding construction logistics and team leadership over the past 6 months. This project will test whether you're ready for genuine responsibility. David felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The uncle he had once dismissed as an embarrassment was offering him a chance to prove himself on one of the most important projects in the company's history. Thank you, Uncle Bobby. I won't let you down. Bobby smiled, the same quiet smile he'd worn when watching his sister celebrate her first major business success 40 years earlier. You already haven't let me down, David. None of you have. Your mother would be proud of the people you're becoming. As the meeting progressed to discuss project timelines and budget allocations, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. Margaret's will had been more than a redistribution of wealth. It had been a carefully crafted lesson in values, family loyalty, and the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. The Henderson siblings were learning what Bobby had always known, that true success wasn't measured by the size of your inheritance or the prestige of your social connections, but by your willingness to serve something larger than yourself and to earn your place through dedication and hard work. Outside the conference room windows, Chicago's skyline stretched toward Lake Michigan, a testament to generations of builders, dreamers, and hard workers who had transformed a frontier town into one of America's great cities. Bobby Henderson understood that he was now part of that legacy, and he was determined to ensure that the next generation of his family would earn their place in it, through character rather than birthright. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning.
1 year after Margaret Henderson's funeral, the Chicago Tribune's Sunday business section featured a full-page spread with the headline, "The Henderson Renaissance: How Military Values Transformed a Real Estate Empire." The accompanying photograph showed Bobby Henderson cutting the ribbon at the grand opening of Liberty Gardens, the first phase of the Southside Veterans Housing Initiative. Standing beside him were David, Catherine, and Patricia, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and hard-earned humility that would have been unimaginable 18 months earlier. The transformation of Henderson Properties under Bobby's leadership had become a case study taught at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. The company's integration of military veterans into key leadership positions had revolutionized their project management efficiency, while their focus on community-centered development had attracted national attention from urban planning experts. What had once been purely a profit-driven real estate company had evolved into something resembling a social enterprise that happened to be extraordinarily successful. Bobby stood in his office that Sunday morning, reading the Tribune article while sipping coffee from a mug that read, "World's Greatest Uncle," a gift from Emma, David's daughter, who had come to understand that her great-uncle was far more remarkable than anyone in the family had ever realized. The office itself reflected Bobby's values: functional, unpretentious, but with walls lined with photographs of completed housing projects, rather than awards or society event pictures. The article detailed not just the business transformation, but the personal journeys of the Henderson siblings. David had emerged as a genuinely capable project manager, his Harvard MBA finally being applied to solve real-world problems rather than simply maintain inherited privilege. His marriage had actually strengthened as he and his wife Sarah began building something together, based on shared work rather than shared spending. Catherine's community development work had earned recognition from the National Endowment for the Arts for her innovative integration of public art into affordable housing projects. Her gallery had pivoted to focus on emerging artists from working-class backgrounds, and while it was less profitable than her previous model, she found herself sleeping better at night, knowing her work was creating opportunities rather than simply catering to wealth. Patricia's legal career had taken the most dramatic turn. She had left high-stakes divorce law entirely, instead becoming Henderson Properties' Director of Legal Affairs and Community Relations. Her sharp legal mind was now focused on navigating the complex regulations surrounding affordable housing development and veteran services. She had also begun volunteering with legal aid clinics, providing pro bono services to veterans dealing with housing discrimination. The newspaper's business reporter had interviewed all three siblings for the article, and their quotes revealed a level of self-awareness and humility that their previous selves would have found incomprehensible. "I spent 45 years thinking I was successful because I inherited the right last name," David had told the reporter. "My uncle taught me that real success is what you build with your own hands and your own character." A knock on Bobby's office door interrupted his reading. Colonel Martinez entered, followed by Commander Liu and the rest of the senior management team for their weekly strategic planning meeting. These sessions had become legendary within the company, a blend of military precision and civilian creativity that consistently produced innovative solutions to complex development challenges. "Sir," Colonel Martinez began, "we've received preliminary approval from HUD for Phase 2 of the Veterans Housing Initiative. They're requesting a presentation for the National Expansion Program." She placed a thick folder on Bobby's desk. "If approved, we'd be looking at a $2 billion commitment across 12 major cities." Bobby opened the folder, scanning the preliminary requirement. A $2 billion project would make Henderson Properties one of the largest affordable housing developers in the United States. But more importantly, it would provide homes for thousands of veterans currently struggling with housing insecurity. "What's our capacity for this kind of expansion?" Bobby asked, his mind already working through the logistics challenges that such a project would entail. Commander Liu consulted his tablet. "With our current team structure and the training programs we've implemented, we could handle the project management aspect. The bigger question is whether we have the leadership depth for that level of expansion." Bobby considered this carefully. Over the past year, he had been quietly evaluating not just his nephew and nieces, but the entire Henderson Properties work. The company's culture had shifted dramatically, attracting employees who were motivated by mission as much as money. But scaling up would require promoting people to positions of significant responsibility. "I think it's time we found out," Bobby said finally. "Schedule individual meetings with David, Catherine, and Patricia for this week. If we're going to take on a project of this magnitude, I need to know they're ready for the next level of responsibility." As the meeting progressed, Bobby outlined his vision for the company's expansion. Henderson Properties would partner with veteran service organizations in each target city, hire local construction workers whenever possible, and ensure that every project included community spaces designed to foster social connections among residents. It was ambitious, complex, and exactly the kind of challenge that Bobby thrived on. After the senior staff departed, Bobby remained in his office, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The view included several Henderson Properties developments, each one now incorporating design elements that prioritized community building over pure profit maximization. The buildings were still profitable, but they served a purpose beyond generating wealth for shareholders. His phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Uncle Bobby, Sarah and I would like to invite you to dinner this Sunday. Emma has been asking when she can show you her latest art project. She says she wants to be a community artist like Aunt Catherine when she grows up." Bobby smiled, remembering how isolated he had felt at Margaret's funeral, standing alone while his family treated him as an embarrassment. Now, a year later, he was not just included in family gatherings, but sought out as a mentor and role model for the next generation. Another message arrived, this one from Patricia. "Wanted you to know that the Legal Aid Clinic is naming their new Veterans Advocacy Program, the Margaret Henderson Legal Initiative. They asked if you'd be willing to speak at the launch event. I know Mom would have been proud." The third message was from Catherine. The mayor's office called about commissioning a sculpture for the new Veterans Memorial in Grant Park. They specifically requested that Henderson Properties oversee the project. I told them I'd need to discuss it with my boss first. Bobby set down his phone and returned to the newspaper article, reading the conclusion that had particularly struck him. The Henderson family's story offers a powerful reminder that true leadership isn't about inheriting power, but about earning the right to wield it responsibly. Bobby Henderson didn't just transform a real estate company, he transformed a family's understanding of what it means to build a legacy that matters. As he prepared to leave the office for the day, Bobby noticed a framed photograph on his desk that hadn't been there that morning. It showed the entire Henderson Properties team at the Liberty Gardens ribbon cutting, with Bobby in the center, surrounded by employees who had become family and family members who had learned to become leaders. Attached was a note in handwriting he recognized as Margaret's, though he couldn't imagine how it had appeared. "Bobby, I always knew you understood what building really meant. Thank you for teaching them what I never could. Love, Mag." Bobby stared at the note for a long moment, then carefully placed it in his desk drawer. Some mysteries were worth preserving, and some gifts from the past were meant to guide the future. The Henderson legacy was no longer about inherited wealth or social status. It was about service, family, and the understanding that the greatest buildings are the ones that house not just bodies but dreams, hopes, and the promise of better tomorrows. 2 years after the funeral that changed everything, Bobby Henderson faced the biggest decision of his business careers. The Henderson Properties boardroom was packed with federal officials, city planners, and veteran advocacy representatives for what had become known as the National Expansion Summit. The $2 billion Veterans Housing Initiative had grown into something unprecedented in scope and ambition, potentially affecting the lives of over 50,000 veteran families across 12 major American cities. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Janet Morrison had flown in from Washington specifically for this meeting, accompanied by a team of federal administrators who would oversee the largest affordable housing commitment in HUD's history. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Henderson Properties was being asked to essentially rebuild how America housed its veterans, with enough funding and authority to transform communities from coast to coast. "Miss Henderson," Secretary Morrison began, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the political and social implications of the project. "This initiative represents more than housing development. It's a fundamental shift in how we honor our veterans' service through action rather than just words." She gestured to the massive presentation materials spread across the conference table. "The question before us today is whether Henderson Properties is prepared to take on what amounts to the largest veterans-focused construction project since the post-World War II housing boom." Bobby sat at the head of the table, wearing a charcoal gray suit that somehow managed to maintain his trademark understated dignity, while commanding respect from some of the most powerful officials in federal government. Around him sat his leadership team, Colonel Martinez, Commander Liu, and the three Henderson siblings who had undergone such dramatic transformations over the past 2 years. David had evolved into something his former self would have found unrecognizable. A project manager whose expertise was sought after by construction firms across the Midwest. His understanding of large-scale logistics, earned through 2 years of hands-on learning rather than inherited assumption, had made him invaluable to the company's expansion plan. He sat quietly taking notes, his focus entirely on the technical requirements being discussed rather than on how the project might enhance his personal status. Catherine had become a nationally recognized expert in community-centered development, her innovative approaches to integrating public art and social spaces into affordable housing having been featured in Architectural Digest and Urban Planning Quarterly. Her work was no longer about impressing wealthy gallery patrons, but about creating environments where working families could build connections and communities. Patricia had perhaps traveled the furthest from her original self. The former divorce attorney who had once specialized in dismantling families was now one of the country's leading experts on veterans' housing law, her sharp legal mind focused on navigating the complex web of federal, state, and local regulations that governed affordable housing development. She had recently been invited to testify before Congress about reforming veterans' housing policies. The scope of this project, Bobby said carefully, his voice carrying the measured tone that had become his trademark in high-stakes negotiations, would require Henderson Properties to essentially triple our current capacity while maintaining the quality standards and community focus that have defined our recent work. He paused, consulting the documents in front of him. That's not just a business challenge, it's a test of whether we can scale our values along with our operations. Commander Liu leaned forward with the operational analysis that Bobby had requested. Sir, we've run the numbers on personnel, equipment and timeline requirements. It's ambitious but achievable, provided we can maintain our current hiring standards and training protocols across all 12 target cities. He clicked to a detailed presentation slide. The bigger question is leadership depth. Managing 12 simultaneous major projects would require promoting several team members to positions of significantly greater responsibility. Bobby nodded, having anticipated this challenge. Over the past 2 years, he had been carefully evaluating not just the Henderson siblings, but the entire company workforce, looking for individuals who demonstrated the combination of technical competence and value alignment that such expansion would require. Which brings us to the leadership question, Bobby said, turning his attention to David, Catherine, and Patricia. This project would require each of you to take on roles that are substantially more challenging than anything you've handled so far. His eyes met each of theirs in turn. David, you'd be overseeing project management across 4 cities. Catherine, you'd be responsible for community development standards nationwide. Patricia, you'd be our primary liaison with federal agencies and veteran service organizations across all 12 markets. The weight of what Bobby was proposing settled over the room. He wasn't just offering his nephew and niece's career advancement, he was entrusting them with the success or failure of a project that would affect tens of thousands of veteran families and potentially reshape how America approached affordable housing development. Secretary Morrison observed this family dynamic with professional interest. Her briefing materials had included the remarkable story of the Henderson family transformation, and she was curious to see how the siblings would respond to this ultimate test of their growth and capability. David was the first to speak, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion that reflected how much the past 2 years had changed him. Uncle Bobby, 2 years ago I would have assumed I deserved these responsibilities because of my last name and my MBA. Today I understand that this isn't about what I deserve, it's about whether I've earned the right to serve these veteran families with the excellence they deserve. Catherine nodded in agreement. The scale of this project is intimidating, but not because of the logistics or the budget. It's intimidating because it represents the opportunity to provide homes for people who sacrificed for our country, and failure would mean failing them. Her voice carried the passion that had developed as she shifted from creating art for wealthy collectors to designing spaces where working families could thrive. Patricia's response reflected the complete transformation of her approach to professional challenge. I've spent the past 2 years learning that the law should be used to build up rather than tear down, to create opportunities rather than exploit weaknesses. This project would allow me to apply everything I've learned about using legal expertise in service of something bigger than personal profit. Bobby listened to their responses with the same careful attention he had once used to analyze sonar readings during submarine patrol. Their words reflected not just professional confidence, but genuine understanding of the responsibility they were being offered. "Secretary Morrison," Bobby said, turning back to the federal officials, "Henderson Properties accepts the challenge, with one condition." He paused, ensuring he had everyone's full attention. "We want to establish mentorship partnerships with veteran-owned construction companies in each target city. This project shouldn't just house veterans, it should create economic opportunities for veteran entrepreneurs." The secretary smiled, recognizing that Bobby's condition actually strengthened the project's potential impact. "Mr. Henderson, that's exactly the kind of innovative thinking that convinced us Henderson Properties was the right choice for this initiative." As the meeting progressed into detailed planning discussions, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, his family had seen him as an embarrassment at Margaret's funeral. Today, they were trusted partners in a project that would define the next decade of his company's mission and potentially impact veteran communities across the entire United States. The ultimate test wasn't just whether Henderson Properties could successfully manage a $2 billion construction project. It was whether the values of service, family loyalty, and earned respect that had transformed the Henderson family could be scaled up to create lasting change for thousands of American heroes who deserved better than society had given them. Bobby Henderson was about to find out if the lessons learned at a funeral could reshape a nation's approach to honoring its veterans. 3 years after Margaret Henderson's funeral, the story that had begun with family humiliation at a Chicago cemetery was about to reach its most public and consequential moment. The Henderson family stood on the steps of the United States Capitol building, surrounded by members of Congress, veteran advocacy leaders, and national media, as President Elizabeth Warren prepared to sign the Veterans Housing Security Act, legislation that had been inspired directly by the success of the Henderson Properties National Initiative. Bobby Henderson, now 71 but carrying himself with the vigor of someone who had found his true calling later in life, stood slightly behind the president as she prepared to sign the bill that would allocate $15 billion over the next decade to veteran housing initiatives modeled after the Henderson Properties approach. The legislation represented the largest commitment to veteran housing in American history, and it had come about because a quiet Navy veteran had transformed a family real estate company into something that caught the attention of the entire federal government. To Bobby's left stood David, Catherine, and Patricia, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride, humility, and amazement at how far they had traveled from the people they had been at their mother's funeral. The same siblings who had once been embarrassed by their uncle's presence at a high society gathering were now standing beside him as he received recognition from the President of the United States. The ceremony was being broadcast live on C-SPAN, CNN, and major network news, with reporters providing background on the Henderson miracle, the transformation of a Chicago real estate company that had become a case study in values-based business leadership. The story had captured national imagination not just because of its business success, but because it represented something Americans desperately wanted to believe, that character and service could still triumph over privilege and entitlement. President Warren approached the microphone with the signed legislation in hand, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd and into the television cameras that would broadcast her words across the nation. The Veterans Housing Security Act represents more than a commitment of federal resources, she began. It represents a fundamental shift in how America honors the service of our veterans, not just with words and ceremonies, but with homes, communities, and opportunity. She turned toward Bobby, her expression conveying genuine respect for what he had accomplished. This legislation exists because of the vision and leadership of individuals who understood that business success and social responsibility are not competing values, but complementary strengths. Her gesture included the entire Henderson family. The Henderson Properties model has demonstrated that when businesses are guided by service and character rather than pure profit,
they can achieve remarkable success while creating lasting positive change. Bobby stepped forward when invited to speak, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had served him well in submarine control rooms and corporate boardrooms. President, members of Congress, fellow veterans, he began. 3 years ago, I was just another aging Navy veteran living quietly on the south side of Chicago. I'm standing here today not because I sought recognition, but because my sister Margaret left me with a challenge that I couldn't ignore. His words carried across the Capitol steps and into the living rooms of millions of Americans who were watching the ceremony. Margaret's will wasn't just about inheritance, it was about inheritance of value. She understood that real leadership isn't inherited through family connections or purchased with wealth, it's earned through service, tested through adversity, and proven through the willingness to put others' needs ahead of your own comfort. David stepped forward slightly, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd and cameras. 3 years ago, I thought I deserved success because I had the right last name and went to the right school. My uncle taught me that success is what you build with your own hands, your own character and your own commitment to serving something larger than yourself. His words carried weight because everyone knew his story. The entitled heir who had been forced to start over and had emerged as a genuinely capable leader. Catherine's voice carried the passion that had developed as she shifted from serving wealthy art collectors to creating spaces where working families could build community. This legislation will provide homes for tens of thousands of veteran families, but more importantly, it will create communities where those families can heal, grow, and contribute to their neighborhood. That's what we learned from Uncle Bobby. That building isn't just about structures, it's about creating places where people can build better lives. Patricia's transformation was perhaps the most visible as she addressed the assembled crowd with the authority of someone who had learned to use sharp legal skills in service of justice, rather than personal profit. 3 years ago, I was a divorce attorney who specialized in tearing families apart for wealthy clients. Today, I'm working to keep veteran families together by ensuring they have stable housing and legal protection. That transformation didn't happen because I suddenly became a better person. It happened because my uncle showed me what it meant to use professional skills in service of something worth building. The ceremony continued with speeches from congressional leaders, veteran advocacy representatives, and HUD officials who detailed how the Henderson Properties model would be scaled across the nation. But the moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts and shared across social media was when President Warren presented Bobby with the Presidential Citizens Medal, the nation's second highest civilian honor. Bobby Henderson, the president announced, represents the best of American values, quiet service, family loyalty, and the understanding that true leadership means lifting others up rather than standing above them. As she placed the medal around his neck, cameras captured the image that would become iconic, a humble Navy veteran being honored by his country while surrounded by family members whose lives he had transformed through patient example and unwavering character. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Bobby found himself surrounded by reporters eager to capture final quotes for their story. But his attention was drawn to a small group standing at the edge of the crowd, a dozen veterans in various states of dress, some in wheelchairs, some clearly struggling with homelessness, all watching the proceedings with expressions of hope mixed with skepticism. Bobby excused himself from the media scrum and walked over to the group, his Presidential Citizens Medal still hanging around his neck. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this isn't just ceremony and politics. In 6 months, we'll be breaking ground on veteran housing communities in 12 cities. If any of you need help finding housing, work, or just someone to talk to, here's my card." He handed out business cards with his personal phone number, the same number he'd been giving to veterans for the past 3 years. A grizzled Marine veteran in a worn desert camouflage jacket looked at the card, then at Bobby, then at the Presidential Citizens Medal. "You really mean a Navy guy's gonna help out Marines?" His question carried decades of inter-service rivalry mixed with genuine need. Bobby smiled, the same quiet smile that had sustained him through decades of patient service. "Marine, the only thing that matters is that you serve. Everything else is just details." As the Henderson family walked away from the Capitol building heading back to Chicago and the work that had consumed their lives for the past 3 years, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Margaret's funeral had been the end of one family story and the beginning of another, a story about what happens when people choose character over comfort, service over status, and family loyalty over social approval. The transformation was complete, but the real work, building homes and communities for America's veterans, was just beginning, and Bobby Henderson, the embarrassing uncle who had become a national leader, was exactly where he belonged.
5 years after Margaret Henderson's funeral, Bobby stood in the same Greenwood Cemetery where his transformation from family embarrassment to national hero had begun. The October morning was crisp and clear, with golden leaves scattered across the manicured grounds and the same Gothic chapel visible in the distance. But everything else about this gathering was different from that humiliating day that had changed the course of the Henderson family forever. Today, the cemetery was filled with over 500 people who had come to celebrate the completion of the Henderson Veterans Memorial Garden, a national monument that would serve as the centerpiece for veteran housing communities across the United States. The memorial had been funded entirely through private donations from corporations, foundations, and individuals who had been inspired by the Henderson property story. Bobby, now 73, stood before the memorial's central granite wall, which bore the inscription, "In memory of Margaret Henderson, who understood that true inheritance is the passing of values from one generation to the next." Surrounding the memorial were smaller stones inscribed with the names of every veteran who had been housed through Henderson Properties developments over the past 5 years, over 12,000 names, representing 12,000 lives that had been changed through the simple decision of a dying woman to leave her fortune to the family member who understood service. The gathering included many of the same Chicago elite who had witnessed Bobby's humiliation at Margaret's funeral, but their attitudes had undergone a complete transformation. Judge Harrison Blackwell, who had watched Patricia's public humiliation of Bobby 5 years earlier, now served on the board of the Henderson Veterans Foundation. Elizabeth Morrison, who had snubbed Catherine at the original funeral, had become one of the foundation's largest donors and had commissioned several art installations for veteran housing communities. Mayor Patricia Coleman, who had attended Margaret's funeral as a political obligation, was now preparing to announce that Chicago would be the model city for a new federal initiative based entirely on the Henderson Properties approach to veteran community development. The same social elite who had once seen Bobby as an embarrassment now competed for opportunities to be associated with his work. David Henderson, now 50, stood with his wife Sarah and their daughter Emma, who was now 12 and served as a volunteer coordinator for the Henderson Veterans Foundation's youth outreach program. David had evolved into one of the most respected construction managers in the Midwest, his expertise sought after by developers across the region. But more importantly, he had learned to measure success by the number of families his projects housed rather than the size of his own bank account. Emma had grown up watching her great-uncle transform from family outcast to national hero, and the experience had shaped her understanding of what real leadership looked like. She had recently written a school essay titled "My Hero Doesn't Wear a Cape," about Bobby's quiet service and how real heroes worked in construction sites and boardrooms rather than seeking fame and recognition. Catherine Henderson Walsh, now 47, had become one of the country's leading experts on community-centered design, her innovative approaches to affordable housing having influenced federal policy and inspired a new generation of socially conscious architects. Her marriage had strengthened as she and Dr. Richard Walsh found shared purpose in creating beautiful, functional spaces for working families rather than luxury showcases for wealthy clients. Patricia Henderson Moore, now 43, had been appointed by the president to serve on the National Commission on Veterans Affairs, using her legal expertise to reform policies that had left thousands of veterans without adequate housing or support services. She had recently been featured on the cover of Harvard Law Review for her groundbreaking work on veterans' rights legislation. All three siblings had learned what Bobby had known all along, that real satisfaction came not from accumulating wealth or status, but from using whatever skills and resources you possessed to serve something larger than yourself. As the memorial dedication ceremony began, Bobby found himself thinking about Margaret and the wisdom of her final gift to the family. Her will hadn't just redistributed wealth, it had redistributed values, teaching her children that inheritance meant far more than money or property. She had given them the opportunity to discover who they could become when they were forced to earn respect rather than inherit it. Attorney Harrison Caldwell, now 78 but still sharp as ever, approached the podium to read a final letter from Margaret that had been sealed with instructions to open it only when the memorial was completed. His voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd as he unfolded the document that had been written in Margaret's precise handwriting. "My dear family," Caldwell read, "if you are hearing this letter, it means that Bobby has succeeded in teaching you what I never could, that our family's greatest inheritance is not our wealth, but our willingness to serve others. Bobby spent his entire life putting family, country, and community ahead of his own comfort, and I knew that given the chance, he would help the rest of you discover the same source of true satisfaction." The letter continued, "David, Catherine, and Patricia, you were born with advantages that Bobby had to earn through 22 years of military service and decades of quiet sacrifice. My will was designed not to punish you, but to give you the chance to earn the respect and self-knowledge that Bobby had already achieved. I hope you have learned, as he learned long ago, that the greatest buildings are not the ones that house your own ambitions, but the ones that house other people's dreams." Bobby felt tears forming in his eyes as Caldwell read the final paragraph. "Bobby, my dear brother, you have always been the family's true success story, even when the rest of us were too proud or too blind to see it. Thank you for showing my children what it means to build a legacy that matters. All my love, Maggie." As the ceremony concluded with the unveiling of the memorial's centerpiece, a bronze statue of a veteran helping to raise the walls of a new home, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 5 years ago, he had been the embarrassing uncle standing alone at the back of his sister's funeral. Today, he was surrounded by family members who had learned to measure success by service, by colleagues who shared his commitment to lifting others up, and by hundreds of veterans whose lives had been changed through the simple decision to choose character over comfort. The transformation was complete, but Bobby understood that the real work would never end. There would always be more veterans who needed housing, more families who needed stability, more young people who needed examples of what it meant to live a life of service rather than selfishness. As the crowd began to disperse and the Henderson family prepared to return to Chicago, Bobby took one last look at Margaret's gravestone, now surrounded by the memorial garden that bore her name. The inscription had been updated to include a new line. She understood that the greatest inheritance is the gift of purpose. Bobby Henderson, the Navy veteran who had once been seen as the family's greatest embarrassment, was now recognized as their greatest teacher, and the lessons he had learned in submarine control rooms and construction sites had become the foundation for a legacy that would house and serve American veterans for generations to come. The funeral that had changed everything was now complete, but the family Margaret had hoped to create through her wisdom was just beginning their real work together. 7 years after Margaret Henderson's funeral, Bobby sat in his office reviewing applications for the Henderson Leadership Institute, a program he had established to train the next generation of veterans in business leadership and community development. The morning sun streamed through windows overlooking Chicago's skyline, illuminating a city that had been fundamentally changed by the work that had grown from a family's transformation at a cemetery gathering years earlier. At 75, Bobby had begun thinking seriously about succession planning, not just for Henderson Properties, but for the broader movement that had emerged from Margaret's wise decision to leave everything to the family member who understood service. The Veterans Housing Security Act had been fully implemented across all 50 states, housing over 100,000 veteran families and creating economic opportunities for thousands of veteran-owned businesses. But Bobby understood that sustainable change required more than government programs. It required leaders who shared the values that had driven the transformation. The Henderson Leadership Institute had become one of the most competitive programs in the country, drawing applications from veterans across all service branches who wanted to learn how to apply military leadership principles to civilian community development. The 6-month intensive program combined classroom instruction with hands-on experience, managing real housing projects, ensuring that graduates understood both the theory and practice of values-based business leadership. Emma Henderson, now 17 and a senior at Chicago's most prestigious preparatory academy, served as a student coordinator for the Institute's youth outreach program. She had grown up watching her great-uncle transform from family embarrassment to national hero, and the experience had shaped her understanding of what real leadership looked like.
Unlike her father David's generation, which had initially measured success through inherited privilege, Emma had learned from childhood that respect was earned through service and character. "Uncle Bobby," Emma said, entering his office with a stack of institute applications, "I've finished reviewing the preliminary essays for this semester's cohort. There's one application I think you need to see personally." She placed a single folder on his desk with an expression that suggested something significant. Bobby opened the folder to find an application from Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a 28-year-old Army combat engineer who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq before being medically discharged after losing her left leg to an IED explosion. Her essay described growing up in poverty in East Los Angeles, joining the Army to escape limited opportunities, and discovering a passion for construction and community development during her military service. What made Rodriguez's application unique wasn't her compelling personal story. Institute applicants had overcome significant challenges, but her innovative proposal for veteran-led urban farming initiatives that could provide both housing and economic opportunities for veteran families in underserved communities. Her vision combined sustainable agriculture, affordable housing, and veteran employment in a way that addressed multiple social challenges simultaneously. "This is remarkable," Bobby said, reading through Rodriguez's detailed business plan. "She's thinking systematically about how to create self-sustaining communities, rather than just providing temporary assistance." He looked up at Emma with approval. "What made you flag this particular application?" Emma smiled with the confidence that came from growing up in an environment where serious social problems were discussed around the dinner table, like other families might discuss sports or entertainment. "She reminds me of you, Uncle Bob. She's not trying to get rich or famous, she's trying to solve problems that other people have given up on, and she has the military background to actually execute complex projects." Bobby nodded thoughtfully. Over the years, he had developed an ability to recognize the combination of vision, discipline, and service orientation that characterized effective leaders. Rodriguez's application demonstrated all 3 qualities, along with the kind of innovative thinking that could push the veteran housing movement in new directions. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. David entered, now bearing the title of Senior Vice President of Operations for Henderson Properties, a position he had earned through 7 years of consistent performance and demonstrated leadership. The entitled heir who had once expected executive positions, based on family connections, had evolved into someone whose expertise was genuinely valued by colleagues and competitors alike. "Uncle Bobby," David said, "I wanted to update you on the Detroit expansion. We're ahead of schedule and under budget on both the veteran housing complex and the job training center." He placed a project report on Bobby's desk. "More importantly, we've been approached by 3 other developers who want to license our community-centered design model for their own project." Bobby reviewed the Detroit numbers with satisfaction. The project represented everything the Henderson approach had come to symbolize: high-quality construction that created both housing and economic opportunities, community spaces that fostered social connections, and training programs that helped veterans transition successfully to civilian careers. "The licensing requests are interesting," Bobby mused. "It suggests that our model is becoming commercially viable, even for developers who aren't primarily motivated by social mission." He looked at David with the pride of a mentor whose student had exceeded expectations. "What's your recommendation on how to handle the licensing inquiries?" David's response reflected the strategic thinking he had developed through years of practical experience, rather than theoretical MBA coursework. "I think we should be selective but open to partnerships with developers who demonstrate genuine commitment to our values. We could establish certification requirements that ensure quality standards while allowing broader adoption of our approach." Emma listened to this conversation with the engaged attention of someone who understood that she was witnessing the kind of strategic planning that could influence thousands of lives. At 17, she was already more sophisticated in her understanding of social impact than most adults, having grown up in an environment where business decisions were evaluated not just on financial returns, but on community benefit. "There's something else," David continued. "Catherine and Patricia have been developing a proposal for expanding the Institute internationally,
They've been contacted by veteran organizations in Canada, the UK and Australia who want to adapt our training model for their own context. Bobby felt a surge of pride at how far his nephew and nieces had traveled from the people they had been at Margaret's funeral. Catherine's expertise in community development and Patricia's legal and policy knowledge had made them sought-after consultants for veteran housing initiatives around the world. The family that had once been embarrassed by military service was now recognized globally for their work supporting veterans. Schedule a family meeting for this weekend, Bobby said. If we're going to consider international expansion, I want to make sure we're doing it for the right reasons and with the right safeguards. He paused, looking out at the Chicago skyline that had been transformed by Henderson Properties development. Margaret's legacy has grown beyond anything we imagined, but it's important that we stay true to the values that made it possible. As David and Emma left his office to prepare for the weekend planning session, Bobby returned to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's application. Her innovative thinking and service orientation reminded him of his younger self, someone who saw problems that others ignored and was willing to work quietly for years to solve them. The next generation of leaders was emerging. Bobby was determined to ensure they understood not just the mechanics of business and construction, but the deeper principles of service, character, and family loyalty that had transformed the Henderson family from entitled inheritors into genuine builders of community and opportunity. The funeral that had changed everything was now 7 years in the past, but its lessons continued to shape new leaders who would carry forward the understanding that true inheritance comes through service, and the greatest buildings are the ones that house other people's dreams. 8 years after Margaret Henderson's funeral, Bobby faced his greatest challenge yet, not from external forces, but from the inevitable passage of time and the need to ensure that everything he had built could survive without him. At 76, he had been experiencing occasional health issues that served as gentle reminders of mortality, and his doctors had advised him to begin reducing his direct involvement in day-to-day operation. The Henderson Properties boardroom was packed for what everyone understood might be Bobby's final major strategic presentation. The company had grown from a regional real estate firm into a national model for veteran housing and community development, with operations in 37 states and international consulting projects in 6 countries. But Bobby knew that sustainable organizations were built on systems and values rather than individual leadership. And today he would announce the most significant transition in the company's history. 8 years ago, Bobby began, his voice still carrying the calm authority that had characterized his leadership style. This company inherited more than financial assets. We inherited a responsibility to prove that business success and social service are not competing values, but complementary strengths. He paused, looking around the room at faces that included not just his family but the diverse leadership team he had assembled over the years. Today, I'm announcing my transition from CEO to Chairman Emeritus, effective immediate. Leadership of Henderson Properties will be assumed by a 3-person executive committee consisting of David Henderson as Chief Operating Officer, Catherine Henderson Walsh as Chief Development Officer, and Patricia Henderson Moore as Chief Legal and Policy Officer. The announcement sent ripples of surprise and concern through the room. While everyone had expected Bobby to eventually step back, the immediacy of the transition caught many off guard. More importantly, Bobby was proposing something unprecedented in corporate governance: shared leadership rather than a single CEO. Colonel Sarah Martinez, now serving as the company's Chief Strategic Officer, raised her hand with the directness that had made her invaluable to the organization. Sir, with all due respect, tri-leadership structures are notoriously difficult to maintain. What safeguards are you proposing to ensure effective decision-making? Bobby smiled, having anticipated this question. Colonel Martinez, the same safeguards that have made our company successful from the beginning: shared commitment to service, family loyalty, and the understanding that our mission is larger than any individual ego or ambition. He gestured toward his nephew and niece. These 3 have spent 8 years learning not just how to manage business operations, but how to subordinate personal interest to organizational mission. David stood to address the room,
his presence now carrying the confidence of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than inheritance. 8 years ago, I couldn't have imagined sharing leadership with anyone, let alone my sister. I thought success meant being the person in charge. His voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, but Uncle Bobby taught me that real leadership means creating systems that work regardless of who's in charge, and building teams where everyone's expertise contributes to shared success. Catherine nodded in agreement. The tri-leadership structure reflects how we've actually been operating for the past 3 years. David handles construction and operations. I focus on community development and design. Patricia manages legal and policy issues. The difference now is that we're formalizing what's already been working. Patricia's response reflected the complete transformation of her approach to professional challenges. More importantly, this structure ensures that no single person can compromise our mission. We've built safeguards into our decision-making process that require consensus on major strategic choices, with Uncle Bobby retaining veto power over any decisions that contradict our core values. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who had graduated from the Henderson Leadership Institute and was now serving as Director of Veteran Outreach Programs, spoke up from her position at the table. Mr. Henderson, what about the Institute and the International Expansion Program? How will those initiatives be affected by the leadership transition? Bobby's expression showed pride in Rodriguez's development as a leader. In the years since joining Henderson Properties, she had demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking and service orientation that the Institute was designed to develop. Her urban farming initiative had been successfully piloted in 3 cities and was now being considered for national implementation. Maria, the Institute will continue under your direction, with Emma Henderson serving as Deputy Director once she completes college. Bobby's announcement that his great-niece would be taking on formal leadership responsibilities at age 18 surprised no one who had watched her development over the past several years. Emma, now a freshman at Northwestern University studying urban planning and business administration, had continued her involvement with the Institute while maintaining a full academic schedule. Her youth provided perspective that complemented the experience of veteran participants, and her insights had contributed to several program improvements over the past year. The international expansion will proceed under Catherine's oversight, Bobby continued, with legal framework support from Patricia and operational guidance from David. We've established partnerships with veteran organizations in 8 countries, and our goal is to adapt the Henderson model to local conditions, rather than simply exporting American approaches. Commander James Liu, who had become Bobby's most trusted operational advisor, asked the question everyone was thinking but hesitant to voice. Sir, what role will you play going forward? The organization has never operated without your direct involvement. Bobby's response reflected the humility that had characterized his leadership from the beginning. My role will be to remain available for consultation while staying out of daily decision-making. The greatest gift I can give this organization is confidence that it can succeed without me. He paused, meeting the eyes of each family member in turn. Margaret's will taught us that true inheritance is about values rather than control. Today, I'm completing that lesson by demonstrating that real leaders create systems that outlast their own involvement. The room fell silent as everyone processed the magnitude of what Bobby was proposing. The man who had transformed a family real estate company into a national movement for veteran housing was voluntarily stepping away from direct control, trusting that the values and systems he had established would continue without his daily oversight. Attorney Harrison Caldwell, now 82 but still serving as the company's general counsel, broke the silence with a question that went to the heart of everyone's concerns. Bobby, how can you be certain that the organization will maintain its mission focus without your direct leadership? Bobby's answer came without hesitation, because the mission isn't mine, it's ours. Every person in this room has invested years of their life in building something larger than individual success. The values that drive our work aren't dependent on my presence, they're embedded in every policy, every project design, every hiring decision we've made. He looked around the room with quiet confidence. Margaret's funeral taught me that real inheritance can't be controlled or managed, it can only be lived and demonstrated. Today, I'm trusting that 8 years of demonstration has been enough. As the meeting concluded with detailed discussions of transition timelines and operational procedures, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The embarrassing uncle who had stood alone at his sister's funeral was now stepping away from an organization that employed over 2,000 people and had housed more than 25,000 veteran families. But the real measure of success wouldn't be the numbers or the awards or the recognition. It would be whether the next generation could carry forward the understanding that business was most successful when it served purposes larger than profit, and that family loyalty meant helping each other become the best versions of themselves, rather than simply protecting inherited advantage. The test of leadership was about to begin, and Bobby Henderson was confident that the lessons learned at a funeral 8 years earlier had prepared his family and his organization for whatever challenges lay ahead.
10 years after Margaret Henderson's funeral, the tri-leadership structure that Bobby had established faced its most severe test. A federal investigation into government contracting irregularities had swept across the construction industry, and Henderson Properties found itself under scrutiny from the Department of Justice and congressional oversight committees. The same company that had been celebrated as a model of ethical business practices was now defending its reputation against allegations of bid manipulation and preferential treatment in federal contracts. David Henderson sat in the Henderson Properties Crisis Management Center, surrounded by legal documents, federal investigators' reports, and news clippings that painted an increasingly damaging picture of the company's relationship with government agencies. At 55, he carried the weight of leadership differently than he had imagined when Bobby first offered him real responsibility 10 years earlier. The entitled heir who had once expected success without effort was now fighting to preserve an organization that employed thousands and housed tens of thousands of veteran families. The situation is serious but not insurmountable, Patricia Henderson Moore announced to the emergency board meeting, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent a decade learning to use legal expertise in service of justice rather than personal gain. The allegations center on our expedited approval processes for veteran housing projects, which some competitors are claiming constitute unfair advantages in federal bidding. Catherine Henderson Wash, participating via video conference from the London office where she was overseeing the European expansion of veteran housing initiatives, added her perspective on the international implications. The investigation is being covered by international media, and our overseas partners are asking questions about whether they should continue their associations with Henderson Properties. We're not just fighting for our domestic operations, we're fighting for the credibility of the entire movement we've helped create. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Henderson Properties was being investigated precisely because they had been so successful at navigating government bureaucracy to deliver housing for veterans quickly and efficiently. Their ability to complete projects ahead of schedule and under budget, skills Bobby had developed through decades of military logistics experience, was now being portrayed as evidence of corruption rather than competence. Emma Henderson, now 22 and serving as deputy director of the Henderson Leadership Institute while completing her master's degree in public administration, spoke with the clarity that came from growing up in an environment where ethical decision-making was discussed as naturally as financial planning. The fundamental question isn't whether we've done anything wrong. Our records are clean. The question is whether we can maintain our mission and our values while defending ourselves against accusations that strike at the heart of what we've built. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, now 32 and serving as Chief Operating Officer of Veteran Programs, brought a perspective that none of the Henderson family members could provide. I've been on the receiving end of government housing programs before joining this company. The reason Henderson Properties gets expedited approvals isn't corruption. It's because we deliver what we promise, when we promise it, for the populations that need it most. Her voice carried the weight of personal experience. These investigations are being driven by competitors who can't match our performance, not by genuine concerns about ethics. The federal investigation had been triggered by complaints from 3 major construction companies that had lost contracts to Henderson Properties over the past 2 years. Their allegations suggested that Bobby's military connections and the company's reputation for veteran advocacy had created an unfair advantage in competing for federal housing contracts. Attorney Harrison Caldwell, now 86 but still sharp as ever, provided the legal framework for understanding the challenges they face. The investigators aren't alleging criminal behavior, they're questioning whether our competitive advantages constitute a level playing field for other contractors. He consulted his notes carefully. The government's position seems to be that our expertise in veteran needs and our track record of successful project completion have created market conditions that disadvantage other firms. Bobby, now 78 and serving as chairman emeritus, had been deliberately absent from the crisis management discussions, maintaining his commitment to let the next generation handle operational challenges. But David had requested his presence for this particular meeting, recognizing that the investigation struck at the core values that had driven the company's transformation. "The question before us," Bobby said quietly, his voice still carrying the calm authority that had characterized his leadership, "isn't how to defend against these accusations. The question is whether we're willing to continue doing the right thing, even when it makes us targets for people who profit from inefficiency and delay." David nodded, understanding that Bobby was offering more than legal advice. He was providing moral clarity in a situation that could easily become confused by political maneuvering and public relations concerns. "Our response strategy needs to be consistent with our values. We defend our methods by demonstrating our results, not by attacking our accusers." Patricia outlined the legal strategy that would guide their response. "We're going to provide complete transparency to investigators, open our books entirely, and invite them to examine every contract, every timeline, every cost saving we've achieved." Her approach reflected the complete transformation of her relationship with legal challenge. "If efficiency and competence in serving veterans is now controversial, then we'll make the case for why those should be celebrated rather than investigated." Catherine added the perspective that would be crucial for maintaining international support. "We need to frame this not as a defense of Henderson Properties, but as a defense of the principle that organizations dedicated to serving veterans should be rewarded for excellence, rather than penalized for success." Emma brought the generational perspective that would be essential for the company's long-term survival. "This investigation is actually an opportunity to demonstrate that the values Uncle Bobby instilled in this organization run deeper than any individual leader or any single contract. If we can maintain our mission focus while under federal scrutiny, we prove that transformation is sustainable." As the meeting concluded with assignments for legal responses, media strategy, and stakeholder communications, Bobby reflected on how different this crisis was from the challenges he had faced during his early years as CEO. Then, the company had been fighting for credibility and recognition. Now they were fighting to maintain their identity and values in the face of success that had made them target. The investigation would ultimately test whether the Henderson family and the organization they had built could maintain their commitment to service and excellence, even when those qualities attracted hostility from competitors and scrutiny from government agents. But Bobby was confident that the lessons learned at Margaret's funeral, about character, family loyalty, and the importance of serving something larger than personal comfort, would guide them through this challenge just as they had guided them through every previous test. The real question wasn't whether Henderson Properties would survive the investigation, the question was whether they would emerge from it with their mission and values intact, ready to continue the work of housing America's veterans, regardless of who tried to stop them. 18 months after the federal investigation began, David Henderson stood before a packed congressional hearing room, preparing to testify before the House Committee on Veterans Affairs about Henderson Properties' role in transforming veteran housing across America. The same investigation that had threatened to destroy everything Bobby had built was about to become the platform for its ultimate vindication. The hearing room was filled with veterans advocates, construction industry representatives, federal officials, and media from across the country. What had begun as an investigation into potential contracting irregularities had evolved into a comprehensive review of veteran housing policy, with Henderson Properties emerging, not as a subject of criticism, but as a model for how government contracts should be managed. Committee Chairman, Congressman Michael Torres, himself a Marine veteran who had served in Iraq, called the hearing to order with remarks that set a tone dramatically different from the adversarial atmosphere that had characterized the early stages of the investigation. "This committee has spent 18 months examining the allegations against Henderson Properties, and what we've discovered has profound implications for how America serves its veterans. David sat at the witness table alongside Patricia, who would be testifying about the legal and regulatory frameworks that had enabled their success, and Maria Rodriguez, who would speak about the practical impact of their programs on veteran families. Catherine was participating via video link from Australia, where she was consulting on veteran housing initiatives for the Australian Defence Force. Bobby watched the proceedings from the gallery, his presence drawing respectful nods from veterans advocates and committee members who understood his role in creating the organization being examined. At 79, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that had characterized his approach to leadership throughout the transformation of his family and his company. Chairman Torres continued his opening remarks with words that sent ripples of surprise through the hearing room. After extensive investigation, the Department of Justice has concluded that Henderson Properties' competitive advantages stem not from preferential treatment or regulatory manipulation, but from superior performance, innovative approaches, and genuine commitment to veteran welfare. The investigation had ultimately worked in Henderson Properties' favor by forcing a comprehensive examination of their methods, outcomes, and organizational culture. Federal investigators had interviewed hundreds of employees, reviewed thousands of documents, and compared their performance metrics with industry standards. The results had been unambiguous. Henderson Properties delivered better housing, faster completion times, and more comprehensive support services than any comparable organization in the country. David began his testimony with the humility that had replaced his former entitlement. Chairman Torres, members of the committee, I want to begin by acknowledging that Henderson Properties' success didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen because we were smarter or more deserving than our competitors. His voice carried clearly through the hearing room microphone. Our success happened because my uncle, Bobby Henderson, taught our family and our organization that excellence in serving veterans isn't just a business strategy, it's a moral obligation. Patricia's testimony focused on the legal and policy innovations that had enabled their efficiency. Our expedited approval processes aren't the result of special treatment from government agencies, she explained to the committee. They're the result of understanding federal regulations so thoroughly that we can navigate them without delays or revision. We hire former government regulatory specialists, not to manipulate the system, but to ensure perfect compliance on the first submission. Maria Rodriguez provided the perspective that carried the most weight with committee members, the voice of a veteran who had experienced both traditional government housing programs and the Henderson Properties approach. Congressmen and congresswomen, she began, I lived in substandard veteran housing for 2 years after my medical discharge. The bureaucracy was endless, the quality was poor, and the support services were minimal. Her voice strengthened as she continued. Henderson Properties didn't just give me an apartment, they gave me a community, job training, and the opportunity to rebuild my life with dignity. The testimony that followed painted a picture of an organization that had achieved efficiency through competence rather than corruption, and market dominance through service excellence rather than political manipulation. Henderson Properties had simply proven that businesses dedicated to mission over profit could outperform competitors focused primarily on financial returns. Chairman Torres read from the final investigative report with evident satisfaction. The Department of Justice concludes that Henderson Properties' competitive advantages are entirely legitimate and result from organizational excellence that should be replicated rather than investigated. He paused for emphasis. The committee recommends that Henderson Properties' methods be studied and adopted as standard practices for all federal contractors serving veteran population. The vindication was complete, but more significant was what the investigation had revealed about the broader impact of Bobby's approach to business leadership. Congressional staff had documented not just housing statistics, but community outcomes. Veteran suicide rates were 40% lower in Henderson Properties developments than in comparable communities. Veteran and family stability metrics exceeded national averages by substantial margin. Emma Henderson, now 23 and serving as executive director of the Henderson Leadership Institute,
watched the proceedings with the pride of someone who had grown up understanding that her family's work was about more than business success. The investigation had validated not just her great-uncle's methods, but the values that had driven the transformation of the Henderson family from entitled inheritors to genuine servants of their community. As the hearing concluded with bipartisan praise for Henderson properties and recommendations for expanding their model throughout the federal contracting system, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The funeral that had begun with family humiliation was concluding with congressional recognition, but the real victory wasn't the public vindication. It was the knowledge that the values Margaret had tried to instill in her family through her will had taken root and flourished. David approached Bobby after the hearing with an expression that mixed relief with something deeper: the satisfaction of having proven worthy of the trust that had been placed in him 11 years earlier. "Uncle Bobby," he said quietly, "I think we passed the test." Bobby smiled with the quiet contentment that had sustained him through decades of patient service. "David, you didn't just pass the test, you exceeded it. Margaret would be proud of what you've all become." As the Henderson family prepared to leave the Capitol building surrounded by veterans advocates and congressional staff members eager to discuss expansion of their programs, Bobby understood that the transformation was truly complete. The family that had once been embarrassed by military service was now being celebrated by the nation's highest legislative body for their dedication to serving veterans. The investigation that had threatened to destroy everything they had built had instead become the platform for its ultimate validation. The values of service, character, and family loyalty that had driven Bobby's quiet leadership for decades were now being recommended as models for federal policy. The funeral was finally over, and the real inheritance had been fully claimed. 15 years after Margaret Henderson's funeral, Bobby Henderson passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by a family that had been transformed by his patient example and unwavering character. The man who had once stood alone at the back of a funeral, dismissed as an embarrassment by his own relatives, was now being mourned by a nation that had come to understand what true leadership looked like. The same Greenwood Cemetery chapel that had witnessed Bobby's humiliation 15 years earlier was now overflowing with thousands of people who had come to pay their respects to a man who had quietly changed America. Presidents, senators, generals, and Supreme Court justices sat alongside homeless veterans, construction workers, and families whose lives had been transformed by Henderson Properties developments. The contrast between this funeral and Margaret's could not have been more striking. David Henderson, now 60 and bearing the quiet dignity that came from decades of earned respect, stood at the podium where 15 years earlier his sister Patricia had publicly humiliated the man they were now honoring. His voice carried clearly through the packed chapel and to the overflow crowds gathered outside, listening through speakers that carried his words across the cemetery ground. 15 years ago, at our mother's funeral in this very chapel, my sisters and I made the worst mistake of our lives, David began, his words heavy with the weight of hard-earned wisdom. We saw Uncle Bobby as an embarrassment, a simple man in a faded uniform who didn't belong among Chicago's elite. We were wrong about everything that mattered. Catherine Henderson Walsh, now 62 and one of the world's leading experts on community-centered development, continued the eulogy with words that would be quoted in newspapers and policy journals for years to come. Bobby Henderson taught us that true inheritance isn't money or property or social status. True inheritance is the passing of values from one generation to the next. The understanding that our lives have meaning only when we use whatever gifts we have in service of something larger than ourselves. Patricia Henderson Moore, now 58, and serving her second term as a federal judge after being appointed to the bench in recognition of her pioneering work in veterans law, spoke with the authority of someone who had learned to use sharp legal skills in service of justice rather than personal gain. My uncle showed us that respect cannot be inherited, purchased, or demanded. Respect can only be earned through character, service, and the patient demonstration of values under pressure. Emma Henderson, now 28 and serving as CEO of Henderson Properties, represented the third generation of family leadership that had learned from childhood what the previous generation had to discover through painful transformation. Great-uncle Bobby never sought recognition, never demanded credit, and never asked for anything more than the opportunity to serve. He showed us that the greatest leaders are often the quietest ones, the people who build rather than boast, who serve rather than seek attention, who lift others up rather than standing above them. The funeral was being broadcast live across multiple networks, with viewers around the world watching as speaker after speaker testified to Bobby's impact on their lives. Veterans who had been housed through Henderson Properties development spoke about communities that had given them not just shelter but belonging. Construction workers talked about job training programs that had transformed their career. Young business leaders from the Henderson Leadership Institute described how military values of service and integrity had shaped their approach to civilian leadership. But the most powerful testimony came from Maria Rodriguez, now 42 and serving as president of Henderson International, the organization that had spread the Henderson model to 17 countries. She spoke as someone who had experienced both Bobby's direct mentorship and the lasting impact of the systems he had created. "Bobby Henderson saved my life," she said simply, her words carrying across the silent chapel. Not dramatically, not heroically, but quietly and patiently, the way he did everything. He took a broken veteran, living in poverty, and taught me that my service to my country had given me skills that could be used to serve my community. He showed me that leadership isn't about commanding others, it's about creating opportunities for others to discover their own strength. As the formal eulogies concluded, the chapel fell silent for a moment of reflection. In that silence, everyone present understood that they were witnessing the end of a story that had begun with humiliation and transformed into something approaching legend. Attorney Harrison Caldwell, now 91 and one of the few people present who remembered both Margaret's and Bobby's funerals, rose slowly to read a final letter that Bobby had written to be opened only after his death. His voice, though weakened by age, carried clearly through the reverent silence. "My dear family," Caldwell read in Bobby's words, "if you are hearing this letter, it means my watch has ended, and yours has begun. 15 years ago, Margaret's funeral taught us all a lesson about what really matters in life. I hope that my funeral teaches that same lesson to a new generation, that the greatest inheritance we can leave our children is not wealth or status, but the understanding that a life well lived is a life spent in service to others." The letter continued, "David, Catherine, and Patricia, you have become the leaders I always knew you could be. You proved that character can be developed, that respect can be earned, and that families can choose to transform themselves through commitment to values larger than personal comfort. Emma, Maria, and all the young leaders who will carry this work forward, remember that the buildings we construct are less important than the communities we create, and the businesses we build are less significant than the lives we touch." Bobby's final words brought tears to eyes throughout the chapel. To anyone who has ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, remember that your worth is not determined by others' recognition. Your value comes from your character, your service, and your willingness to keep doing the right thing even when no one is watching. The funeral that changed my life began with humiliation and ended with understanding. I hope that my funeral marks not an ending, but a beginning, the start of your own journey toward discovering what it means to build a legacy that truly matters. As the service concluded and mourners began to file out of the chapel, they passed a new memorial that had been installed beside Margaret's grave. The inscription read, "Robert Bobby Henderson, Navy veteran, teacher, build." He understood that true leadership means creating more leaders, not more followers. But the real memorial to Bobby Henderson wasn't carved in granite. It was living in the hundreds of thousands of veteran families who had been housed through his work, the thousands of young leaders who had been trained through his institute, and the transformation of an entire industry toward values-based business practices. The funeral that had begun 15 years earlier with a family ashamed of their veteran uncle was ending with a nation grateful for his service, the inheritance that Margaret had tried to give her children through her will, the understanding that character matters more than comfort, that service creates more satisfaction than status, and that family loyalty means helping each other become better, rather than simply protecting shared privilege, had been fully claimed. As the Henderson family stood together at Bobby's grave, they understood that the greatest tribute to his memory would be continuing the work he had started. The transformation was complete, but the mission would continue for generations to come. The embarrassing uncle had become America's teacher, and the lesson he taught would echo far beyond his lifetime, that in a world obsessed with wealth and status, the people who choose service over self will always build the legacies that last. The end is the moral of the story. True inheritance isn't what you receive, it's what you become. Respect cannot be bought, inherited, or demanded. It can only be earned through character and service.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.